was a quiet morning in Ohio, the kind of morning that feels normal, almost unremarkable. But inside the Williams house, everything changed in an instant. Greg Williams was dead, shot once in the head, right inside his own home. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no one running away, just a house that looked ordinary until it wasn't. The person closest to him? His wife, Michelle Williams. What looked at first like a tragic accident slowly started to look different. A marriage under strain, a life lived behind closed doors, choices with consequences no one could undo. This is the story of Michelle Williams, and the morning that revealed a truth no one expected. Before the flashing lights, before the interviews, before the case files and courtroom debates, there was just a house. Quiet, familiar, normal. It was a place where routines mattered, where mornings followed the same rhythm, where doors opened without fear, footsteps didn't raise alarm, and life moved in predictable patterns. For Greg Williams, this was home, a place he believed was safe, a place where danger wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, this is where his life ended. Investigators moved through the rooms carefully, not because the scene was chaotic, but because it wasn't. Every detail stood out because nothing seemed out of place. Furniture hadn't been moved, personal items were where they were supposed to be. The absence of disorder became in itself a clue. This wasn't the result of a struggle. There was no panic, no signs of violence spiraling out of control. It was quiet, and quiet demands questions. The gunshot that killed Greg hadn't echoed through the neighborhood. No one heard screams. No one saw a fight. Whatever happened inside that house, it happened without resistance. That fact stayed with the investigators. People fight strangers. People run from intruders. People scream when they're scared. Greg didn't, which meant whatever happened, he didn't see it coming. As detectives looked closer, they didn't just study the scene, they looked at the life inside it. Greg and Michelle Williams weren't newly married. They had years together, shared history, shared responsibilities, shared burdens. Like many couples, their relationship had been tested over time. Some changes were expected, others harder to manage. But underneath it all, things had been unraveling. Arguments had started to happen more often. Tension had crept into everyday life. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that quietly reshapes how two people live together. Friends would later describe a marriage that felt off balance. Distance, dissatisfaction, a partnership that wasn't what it used to be. It didn't prove anything criminal, but it mattered because investigators don't just ask how someone died, they ask why. And maybe most importantly, why then? When Michelle spoke to police, she tried to explain the unexplainable. But as the hours passed, detectives noticed something. Her story didn't fill the silence. Key moments felt short, rushed, some details were skipped. Questions that should have brought clarity only left gaps. And in a house with no forced entry, no outside suspects, no signs of struggle, every missing detail becomes loud. Investigators are trained to notice not just what's said, but what isn't. And in Michelle's account, there were pauses that lasted too long. Moments that felt remembered from practice, not from reality. Not outright lies, not shocking contradictions, just enough uncertainty to raise concern. As the forensic teams wrapped up their work, the truth started to become harder to ignore. The evidence didn't point outside the house. There were no signs of a stranger. Nothing suggested chance or coincidence. It pointed inward, toward the people who lived there, toward their routines, toward their relationships, toward the tension no one outside could see. Slowly, almost reluctantly, investigators began to realize this case wasn't a random tragedy. It was something far more personal. A death that didn't come from an outsider, but from someone who already had access. Someone who didn't need permission to be there. By the end of that first day, one question hung over the investigation. If Greg Williams didn't fear the person standing next to him, if he didn't try to run, if he didn't fight back, then what did he think was about to happen? And maybe even more disturbing, when did trust become dangerous? As the house fell quiet again, detectives understood they weren't just investigating a death. They were untangling a marriage. Long before the gunshot, something had already broken inside the Williams home. It didn't happen suddenly. There wasn't one big fight, one dramatic moment friends could point to and say, that's when it started. It happened like many relationships fall apart, quietly. Slowly, behind closed doors. From the outside, Greg and Michelle still looked normal. They managed responsibilities, shared a home, went through routines that suggested everything was fine. But routines can be misleading, because sometimes routine isn't calm. Sometimes it's survival. As detectives spoke with people close to the couple, a clearer picture began to emerge. Greg and Michelle weren't on the same page. Their marriage was tense, weighed down by unresolved issues. Financial pressures added strain. Arguments lingered without resolution. Communication had grown distant, sometimes cold, sometimes sharp. This wasn't a relationship built on constant fights or outbursts. It was something quieter. A marriage defined by dissatisfaction, by distance, by a slow shift in balance that no one outside could notice. And resentment doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. When investigating domestic deaths, detectives don't jump to conclusions. They build context. They reconstruct emotional timelines just as carefully as physical ones. They ask who had motive, who had opportunity, who had something to gain or lose, and just as important, who had access. In the Williams case, access was impossible to ignore. Michelle wasn't just nearby, she shared a life with Greg. She knew his routines, his habits, his expectations. She knew when he was vulnerable. That closeness didn't prove guilt, but it ruled out coincidence. When Michelle spoke with police, she wasn't panicked in the way officers often expect after someone loses a spouse suddenly. That doesn't mean she wasn't grieving, but her grief didn't match the situation. Her statements were calm, controlled, sometimes too controlled. Detectives noticed subtle inconsistencies. Not obvious lies, but shifts in emphasis. Some details were repeated, others were skipped. Certain moments felt polished rather than natural. These weren't proof of anything, but they were enough to pay attention. Because when someone is genuinely shocked, memories fracture. Timelines blur, details collapse. Michelle's story didn't do that. It held its shape. And maybe the most unsettling part wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. There were gaps, missing reactions, moments where fear or confusion should have been obvious, but weren't. Investigators are trained to sit with that silence, to let it stretch and see if answers appear on their own. In this case, they didn't. And the longer the silence lasted, the heavier it felt. By the time detectives finished the first round of interviews, the case had quietly but clearly shifted direction. This wasn't about an unknown intruder anymore. There was nothing leading away from the house, no trail, no evidence of anyone entering from outside. Every lead, every timeline, every unanswered question circled back to the house, back to the marriage, back to Michelle Williams. And with that realization came an unspoken understanding among the team. This case wouldn't be solved by chasing shadows. It would be solved by looking at what had been in plain sight all along. When emotions run high, investigators rely on something that doesn't bend. Time. Timelines don't care how someone feels. They don't adjust for grief or intention. They either fit or they don't. And in Greg Williams' death, time was about to become the most unforgiving witness of all. Detectives started by reconstructing Greg's last movements, minute by minute, step by step, where he was, who he talked to, what he was supposed to do next. Phone records were checked. Daily routines were mapped. Investigators compared Michelle's account to objective markers. Calls, timestamps, physical evidence. At first, her story seemed plausible, but plausible isn't the same as accurate. As they looked closer, edges didn't line up. Certain windows of time stuck out. Periods where Michelle's account depended on absence. Moments no one else could verify. Gaps that required trust instead of proof. Investigators went over those gaps again and again, because in homicide cases, gaps aren't neutral, they're opportunity. And here that opportunity existed inside a marriage, inside a home, inside a routine that required no explanation to be close. Greg hadn't deviated from his schedule. There were no unexpected visitors, no sudden detours. Whatever happened unfolded in the middle of a normal day, which made it extraordinary. Attention turned back to the physical evidence. The gunshot wound told a quiet story. No sign of panic, no frantic firing, just one fatal shot, delivered with precision. Ballistics and forensics supported what detectives already suspected. This wasn't an impulsive act born from chaos. It was controlled, and control suggests intent. The scene showed no struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest Greg had tried to flee or protect himself. That absence spoke volumes. Because people don't freeze in sudden danger unless they don't recognize it as danger at all. Greg didn't run, he didn't fight, he didn't call for help. Those facts haunted the investigators. They pointed to something unsettling. Greg trusted the person near him in his final moments. Trust doesn't vanish instantly, it erodes slowly, if it erodes at all. And that trust narrowed the focus more than any piece of physical evidence ever could. As the investigation moved forward, detectives kept coming back to Michelle Williams. They asked the same questions again and again and again, not to provoke her, but to watch, because truth tends to stay consistent under repetition. Stories meant to protect rarely do. Subtle changes started to appear, shifts in wording, small adjustments, tiny recalibrations that suggested Michelle wasn't recalling events, she was maintaining them. And that distinction mattered. By this point, detectives weren't asking if Michelle could have killed her husband. They were asking if the evidence allowed for any other explanation, and the answer was becoming harder to ignore. No forced entry, no other suspect, no timeline pointing anywhere else. Every road led to the same place. Back to the house, back to the marriage, back to the person with both access and motive. Probability started to replace possibility, and in criminal investigations, that shift changes everything. Up to this point, the case against Michelle Williams had been mostly inference, on timelines that didn't quite line up, on a marriage under stress, on a scene that pointed inward, not outward. But inference alone doesn't close cases. Evidence does. Now the investigation entered its most exacting phase. Detectives returned to the Williams house again and again, not looking for something dramatic, but listening to what the space itself had already said, the way Greg's body was positioned, the absence of defensive wounds, the single controlled gunshot. Each detail reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't a chaotic confrontation. Greg wasn't caught off guard by a stranger. He didn't fear the person next to him, at least not until it was too late. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The bullet's trajectory, the lack of erratic movement. One fatal shot. No panic, only intention. Prosecutors often say motive explains why, but access explains how. And Michelle Williams had access to everything that mattered. She didn't need to force entry. She didn't need to lure Greg anywhere unfamiliar. She didn't need to wait for a perfect moment. She lived inside the opportunity. Investigators looked at how the gun could have been obtained, handled, and used without attracting attention. Nothing about it required extraordinary effort, just timing and proximity, and that made it more disturbing, because it didn't interrupt life. It fit into it. As evidence piled up, Michelle's statements were examined line by line, not for what she claimed outright, but for what she left out. Certain details were repeated, others were vague. Key moments lacked the confusion, adrenaline, or emotional chaos you'd expect from someone witnessing sudden trauma. Her story didn't evolve naturally over time, it stayed rigid. And in criminal investigations, rigidity often signals control rather than memory. Forensic experts weighed in, not speculating, but interpreting the science. The wound suggested close proximity. The absence of struggle pointed to familiarity. The scene didn't match an unexpected threat. Every expert didn't just add facts, they confirmed a pattern. And patterns are what juries understand. By now, investigators weren't exploring possibilities, they were eliminating them. No credible third party, no trail leading away, no timeline pointing to anyone else. What remained was clear. This was a domestic homicide, committed by someone who didn't need to explain why they were there, someone who belonged there. There was no single dramatic breakthrough, no confession, no piece of evidence that changed everything overnight. Instead, there was a quiet, professional moment when investigators realized they had enough to move forward, enough to press charges, enough to say with confidence, Greg Williams did not die at the hands of a stranger. He was killed by someone who shared his life. And with that understanding, the investigation crossed an invisible line, from inquiry to accusation. Courtrooms don't start out dramatic. They're quiet, restrained, procedural. Wood, fluorescent lights, people sitting still, waiting. But behind that stillness lies consequence. Because here, stories stop being personal. They become evidence. For Michelle Williams, the life she'd lived behind closed doors was about to be examined in public. Prosecutors simple. This wasn't a case of rage or chaos. It was a case built on access, opportunity, and intent. Greg Williams had been killed inside his own home, without struggle, without forced entry, without fear. The prosecution walked the jury through what didn't happen. No break-in, no unknown suspect, no explanation beyond the marriage itself. They spoke about the controlled nature of the gunshot, the lack of defensive wounds, a scene that suggested familiarity, not confrontation. This wasn't a crime of panic, they said. It was a crime of decision. As witnesses took the stand, the focus shifted from Michelle alone to the marriage itself. Friends, acquaintances, and those who knew the couple described a relationship under strain. Not explosive, not violent, but heavy, marked by unresolved conflict and distance. Prosecutors were careful. They didn't paint Michelle as a monster. They didn't sensationalize the marriage. They presented it as a relationship quietly collapsing, and they asked the jury to consider a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a failing marriage isn't a fight. It's the silence that follows. In court, evidence is tested. Ballistics experts explain the wound. Forensic specialists walk jurors through the scene. Investigators described the lack of alternative suspects and how the case had narrowed over time. Every piece of evidence was challenged. Every conclusion questioned. And yet, the same truth kept emerging. The physical facts didn't support Michelle's story. Her statements were reviewed, not to shame, but to compare. Jurors saw how some details stayed rigid while others shifted. Key moments weren't corroborated. Many explanations required acceptance rather than proof. The prosecution didn't need to prove what Michelle felt. They needed to show what she did. The defense urged caution. They reminded the jury that suspicion is not proof. Grief looks different for everyone, and absence of evidence is not evidence of guilt. They argued that the case relied heavily on interpretation, on what investigators thought should have happened, not on what could be proven. For a moment, doubt lingered, because doubt always does. But as closing arguments came, the case returned to its core truth. Greg Williams was killed in his own home by someone with unquestioned access. At a time when no alternative could be verified, the prosecution asked the jury to step back and look at the case as a whole, not as separate facts but as a single chain. And when viewed that way, they argued, the conclusion was clear. This was not a mystery. It was accountability, delayed. When the jury returned, the courtroom grew silent. No cameras flashing, no gasps, just the sound of a decision read aloud. Michelle Williams was found guilty. In that moment, years of investigation, analysis, and quiet tension collapsed into one outcome. Greg Williams' death was no longer a question. It was a crime, with a name attached. The verdict brought legal closure, but it did not bring Greg back. It did not heal the fractures that led to his death. It did not answer every question left behind. Courtrooms can decide guilt, they can assign responsibility, they can impose consequences, but they cannot pinpoint the moment when love turns into something else entirely. If you found this story meaningful, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber helps us continue sharing stories that matter.